And so I want to talk just a little bit now about what is the type of society, like what was the Limon life that she found herself in, this woman from Jamaica. And just here's an image of old Limon and the railroad tracks and the houses that were there. And so I want to talk just a little bit about what Limon was like, what she would have found. So we know that Limon as a town, as a city, was founded in 1870. And even today in Costa Rica, it is still the major port on the Atlantic coast of Costa Rica, where 80% of all goods for the country are imported and exported even today in the 21st century. What we find is that most of Limon at the time where my great grandmother was living was really populated by Afro Caribbean English speakers. And they were predominantly from Jamaica and Barbados, but you had other spaces as well. So I wouldn't say that there were not Martinicans there or people from St. Croix, obviously Bahamas, they were there, but the largest population were primarily from Jamaica, though we did have other representations of Caribbean islands there. I don't want it to seem like it was only Jamaica and Barbados. But in terms of predominance, I think that even in cultural articulation, it was really Jamaican that sort of set the trend of how that Caribbean Limon became sort of a Caribbean entity. And so they began, they also started to work for the Northern under Minor Cooper Keith, who eventually then consolidated, and it became, at the completion of the railroad, it became the United Fruit Company. So the first ship that arrived with Jamaican laborers was the Lizzie, and it arrived in 1872. And by 1874, it was said that at least 1,396 Jamaican laborers had entered Limon and were living here building the railroad. And so, what was very interesting is that this community, a couple of things. One, the first group of laborers that were coming for the railroad, they were people who were already educated. They were people who had visions of, I'm working for this time period, I'm getting this money, and then I'm returning home to build family and build legacy, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens is, because of the United Fruit Company and their inability to compensate a lot of the workers, they ended up giving them parcels of land, right? And so people begin to get attached to the land, but also begin to form families here. And so you have multiple generations of people who were sort of 1 foot in, right, in terms of Costa Rica or Limon, and then 1 foot out in terms of the Caribbean. And many of them were multiple migrants, meaning that they went to Jamaica, came back to Limon. So people moved back and forth, and even also to Panama. So that Atlantic world was incredibly busy. So people got a lot of information all the time. There was a lot of movement. And they were, in terms of religion, they were not Catholics, which obviously predominated the Central Valley, and the mestizos, the Spanish speaking mestizos of Costa Rica, they were very much Catholics. And today, Costa Rica, we know, is a Catholic country. They were predominantly Baptist and Methodist, but there were also other Christian religions. And what happens is they bring these immigrants a very clear Caribbean sensibility, respectability, politics in terms of the roles of women and men. It is involved in how they articulate their cultural and political societies, their social lodges, their burial schemes, their food rituals, their spirituality, and even how they educated their children, which is they created English speaking schools following the Jamaican or British method, and they imported teachers from Jamaica to teach their children. So it was only after the Civil War in 1948 where the government decides to allow these Afro Caribbeans to essentially naturalize in by 1956 that they become citizens, right? So for many people, they were either Jamaican, or even though they had been born in Limon generationally, they were still landless or citizen. They didn't have a national identity unless they took the identity of their parents, right? So my mother was born in Limon, and her mother was born in Limon. And not until 1956 were both of them able to actually naturalize and become Costa Ricans, even though my mother was a second generation Costa Rican, right? Which is really interesting. And how, but there, the process of assimilating and becoming a citizen also means that you had to give up certain things. And one of the many things they had to give up was going exclusively to English language schools, but they had to join the Spanish language schools. So you have this younger generation that begins to um, take in Spanish and then understand all those cultural values that are embedded in that educational system, which is radically different than the Caribbean British-based system that they were used to. So you also had many kids like my mother and her sisters who attended Spanish school in the morning and then attended English school in the afternoon because their parents were really clear about maintaining a cultural trajectory, something straight. They were not willing to sacrifice that education with their children. Um, and so one of the things that I really want to point out is at this point, Limon was a world that was facing the Atlantic world, right? So my mom tells me all the time about how she used to get, from the ships, the 45 records of whatever music was happening out of Motown, in the 50s and the 60s. And that's the music they engaged with. They were not looking inward into the Central Valley and San Jose. Limon was a world that was way more cosmopolitan. They engage with sailors from all over the world, and just shipments, people who were coming in who were doing the business of the port. And so newspapers and letters and just art and culture was incredibly rich because you had this huge mashup of different people. So it was a very cosmopolitan space that was predominantly English speaking, and in many ways, they felt in the Central Valley and in the highlands of San Jose, that was a world that was almost more rural, right? It was something that they were a bit above, right? And there was no interest in actually intermingling, because I think even in the older generation, there was still this nostalgia of, even though I have one or two generations here already, I'm going back home to Jamaica, right? So there was still that idea of wanting to be back, of a longing, right? And I think the younger generation, probably by the third generation in, they are no longer. They no longer have that particular nostalgia of their of their grandparents who spend their time talking about, going to Calabar in Jamaica or going to all these places, talking about Otorios or whatever. They are they're thinking about other things, and they're thinking about a Costa Rican identity and how they will progress in the country in which they're living in. And so I think that those are sort of that's what happens in the generations as they are deeply established. But it was a black world, right? And so so the United Fruit Company, white Americans. You had, obviously you had a Chinese population as well that they were brought in as indentured workers, and they were established in the town. So as I said, it was very multicultural, but it was predominantly black and English speaking. And then by 1920, we had Marcus Garvey, who had over 23 branches of the United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, along that Caribbean coast. So that was by 1920. So you can just imagine that it was a deeply rich and thriving community that had a lot of movement, and it was very educated community. And also, I think what was central to the community, and specifically to my great grandmother Ruth, was the spiritual life, the Christian life, the church life, and how they really forged identities and communities around the church. And so here's a picture of the United Fruit Company and the bananas and the railroad, just an image of what that life looked like. And here's a picture of it's really the house, but these are my cousins. And these are three of my cousins. And so the house behind is the first house that Ruth and William lived in. And in Limon, in Jamaica Town, which is now called Barrio Roosevelt, but in Jamaica Town, this was their first house. It's actually a two-family house. So they lived on the right side. It was a small house, but it was honest, you know. And these are three of my great grandmother's grandchildren, right? And so I wanted to show the picture of them, but also I wanted to show the picture of the house. So this is the house in which my Ruth and William started their lives in Limon and started the generations in which I am now in the fourth generation. And so this is the northern quarters. This is the hotel or the quarters in which William and Ruth ran, but after 1937 to 1956, my great grandmother Ruth ran this by herself, and her daughters, particularly Beatrice, helped a lot, and her son-in-law Oscar McCrae was assisted her with the finances. So he was the one who sort of did the numbers, but Ruth was essentially the head of this entire organization here.
Somos voces de la historia, sangre, tinta y papel. Somos voces de la historia, mis ancestros, su saber. Mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber.